Hello, Seekers. Today, my name is Miss Allison and this is Miss Kira, and today we're going to tell you another story about Jesus and his great love for us. So, if you remember, our Bible verse for this week is Jeremiah 29:13. You will find me when you search for me. And our VBS motto is seek truth and find Jesus. So, I hope you've remembered the past few stories that we've learned about these past few days. We'll review them real quick. Can you think back a couple days ago for the first day of VBS? Do you remember what y'all learned about? Well, if you said Jesus' birth, you are right. So Jesus came as God promised. God told prophets about Jesus' birth and how it would happen, and Jesus came exactly how God said he would. So if you remember on day 2, you learned about Jesus showing everyone God's great power, which is exactly what it says up here. If you remember what he did to the blind man, so he was able to heal the blind man and give him sight again just by using his spit and some dirt to make some mud. All right, and yesterday you learned about Jesus and his Last Supper with his friends. So Jesus followed God's plan for his life. And today we're going to go off that as well as Jesus continued to follow God's plan for his life. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of a spoiler alert. The story starts off a little sad, but I promise it ends with an amazing ending. It's very happy, and you will be completely filled with joy after you hear this whole story. All right, so I'm going to ask my lovely friend, Miss Kira, to talk about our artifact for today.
Okay, hi Seekers. So today's artifact for day 4 is a tombstone. So what they use the tomb for is they would put people's bodies after they passed away in, and the tombstone, they would put it over the tomb and it would seal it so no one could get in.
And the cool thing about a tombstone is actually they were very, very large rocks. So they were 4 to 6 feet tall. That's taller than me and Kira. They are huge. And so they would seal off this cave after they would put people in them who had passed away. The cool thing is that Jesus actually had in front of his tomb, he had a round one. This actually spoke of wealth. So most people who didn't have a lot of money, they just had a big flat rock stuck in front of their tomb. But Jesus was put into a wealthy man's tomb, so he actually was able to get a big round rock to put over in his tombstone. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we dive into our story. But first, before we do, Miss Kira has a couple of relics that she's going to show you, or a couple of objects, and I want you to be able to listen to the story so we can talk about these objects later. You're going to have to look for them throughout the story.
Okay, first we have the Bible. Then we have the crosses. We have Mary, a tomb, and an empty tomb.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read our story, so hopefully you can look at the picture on the screen and follow along. All right. God told us in the Bible that Jesus would be born and that later he would die. After Jesus died on a cross, he was buried in a tomb. A woman named Mary went to the tomb. She was sad that Jesus had died. When Mary got there, she was surprised to see that the stone that had been used to close the tomb was removed. Jesus was gone. Mary was worried, and she ran to tell the disciples. Peter and John excitedly raced to the tomb and looked inside. Jesus was not there. Mary stood outside the tomb crying. She saw someone there, but she thought he was the gardener. The man said, "Mary." Immediately, Mary knew he was Jesus. She was so happy. She couldn't wait to tell the disciples. "I have seen the Lord," she said. "Jesus is alive." And that story came from Isaiah 53:5, 9 through 11, and John 19:17 through chapter 20:18. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about our story today. So, Jesus continued to fulfill the plan that God had for him. God sent his son to this earth to die on a cross for us to save us from our sins because he loved us so greatly. So, God was put on a cross between 2 criminals and put to death. So, after he died, they put him into a tomb Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So he was a wealthy man, and so that's how God was able to have the rolling stone in front of his tomb. So a few days after Jesus was put in the tomb, Mary went back to the tomb to check on everything. When she got there, she saw that the tomb had been rolled away and Jesus was not there. And so she began to be very worried, and she was very sad. So have you ever been to the store and maybe wandered off and then you came back and you couldn't find your mom or dad? How did you feel in that situation? Were you happy that you couldn't find them? No, you were very sad. You were very worried that you couldn't find them. And that's exactly how Mary felt. She couldn't find her friend. So Mary went and told Peter and John, some of Jesus' other friends, about this, and they were just as shocked as she was. So they ran back to the tomb, and they saw that the tomb was empty and began to be worried. Mary saw someone off in the distance, and she thought it was just the gardener. But it turns out it was Jesus. So imagine that you're very sad. Imagine that you are in the store and you can't find your mom and dad, so you just put your head down and you start to cover your face and you start to cry and you're just super sad. And then all of a sudden, someone comes behind you, puts their hand on your shoulder, and all they do is say your name. And you know them just by hearing their voice. So you know that it's your mom and dad coming back to comfort you. That's exactly what happened in this story too. Mary knew as soon as Jesus said her name, she knew that it was Jesus, and she was filled with joy again. So the big point of this story is that Jesus is alive. Jesus was put to death on a cross, buried in a tomb, but on that third day, he was alive and came back for us. All right, now in your packet that you got a couple of these relics that we're going to go over. So I'm going to ask Kira to answer some questions by holding up our objects, and I want you to do the exact same thing. All right, so this first part of the story we talked about, and even in the days past, we talked about how God told prophets about Jesus' birth and his life that he would have on earth, okay? So it's amazing that these prophets heard so clearly from God and that they wrote these things down about what would happen hundreds of years in the future. What do you think, which object do you think goes along with this one? Just take a moment to find your objects. Which one do you think goes along with prophets writing down God's plan? All right, Kira, what do you think?
I think the Bible.
That's exactly right. So the prophets actually wrote down in a book about God's plan for Jesus' life. Jesus did exactly what he came here to do. He died for us. Now, what object do you think goes along with this part of the story?
The crosses do.
Exactly. Jesus died on the cross for us. All right, we have a couple more objects that we have to learn about, okay? So after Jesus died, he was buried in a cave that had a stone over it. Which object do you think this is?
I think it is the tomb that Jesus was placed in.
Exactly. So a tomb is just a large cave that people were buried in back in Jesus' time. A few days after Jesus was buried in there, the rich man's tomb was open and Jesus was gone. So which object goes along with this part of the story?
The object that goes along is the empty tomb.
Exactly. So after a few days had passed, Jesus was alive, so he had left the tomb and it was completely empty. All right, we have one more object that we need to talk about. And the last one is, who was the first person to find the empty tomb?
Mary was the first one to find the empty tomb.
Exactly. So Mary went there a couple days after to find Jesus, and he was gone. So she ran and told Peter and John, and they came back to see as well. All right. And one last thing before we start reviewing our questions that we have for this is we're going to go over some of the emotions our characters may have been feeling. All right. So first, we're going to review some of our emotions. So I'm going to ask Kira to do some facial expressions, and you need to pause and guess what facial expression she's, or what emotion she is showing, okay?
What do you think that was? What emotion was that? We have that one, and we have
Angry.
Yeah. And what was that emotion?
All right, so now that we know all of our different emotions, we're going to work through our story one last time for a good review, and we're going to talk about some of the emotions that our characters were feeling. All right, so after Jesus was put to death on the cross and then buried in the tomb, how do you think Mary and his friends were feeling? All right, so on the screen, you're going to have a small strip of emotions. They're going to be different faces that are showing different emotions. I want you to point to the emotion that best describes that. So how was Mary and her friends feeling once they found out that Jesus was dead? All right, Kira, what do you think?
I think they were very sad that Jesus was put in the tomb and he had died.
That's right, they were very, very sad about it. All right, so the next one is, how do you think that Mary felt when she saw the empty tomb?
Mary was probably feeling really surprised that the tomb was empty.
All right. How do you think Peter and John felt when Mary told them that the tomb was empty?
They were probably shocked as well.
All right. And how do you think Mary felt when she looked all over to find Jesus' body and she couldn't find it?
Like very worried.
All right. And our last question is, how do you think Mary felt when she heard Jesus say her name?
She was very excited to hear Jesus say her name.
Yes, Mary was overjoyed to see that Jesus was alive. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read our review questions for the day. Don't forget to go and answer these on the website so y'all can get your t-shirt. So here are our 5 review questions for day 4. So, what is a tomb? Who was the first person to see that the tomb was empty? Who was supposed to be in the tomb? Why wasn't Jesus in the tomb? And then finish the statement. Jesus is blank. All right, so I asked Kira to do one thing for me, so we're going to review today's point. So, we know that Jesus is no longer in the tomb because Jesus is alive. So I asked Kira to write today's point on one side of the paper plate, and I think that it would be a great idea if y'all did the same thing as well. Find a paper plate, a piece of paper at home, get a marker or a crayon, and write today's point on one side of the paper, okay? So Kira, what's today's point to review?
Today's point to review is Jesus is alive.
Awesome, so Jesus is alive. All right, next, I asked her to write an emotion on the back of the plate of how she feels about Jesus being alive. So on the back of your piece of paper or plate, I want you to draw whatever face, whatever emotion that you feel when you hear that Jesus is alive.
I did happy as an emotion because I would be happy that Jesus is alive.
All right, so I hope that y'all also have a very happy face on your plate as well.
Today we are going to review our topic of the day, so I'm going to come over here and we are going to pick this up.
And there's our empty tomb, our artifact for the day.
Today's topic of the day is Jesus is alive.
All right, and thank you, Seekers, for joining us today for day 4. I hope you learned about God's great love for us and everything that Jesus did for us. And I hope you come back to hear another amazing story tomorrow.